Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And today we're joined by Stuart McAllister. I call him Dad. You don't. And that's all right.
Fan favorite.
That's right. But, so welcome, Stuart, Dad.
Thank you. It's good to be here again.
Well, we want to draw on your extensive experience as a missionary, but also as a person who continues to travel widely. And we want to talk a little bit about the state of the church in North America, which might sound broad initially, but I think on a very basic level, if you look at the conversations that are going on around us, if you read from, different Christian websites, different articles, everybody seems to be wrestling with the question, what does it mean to be a Christian right now? And how do we make sense of our experience now in North America? You hear the word exile being used more and more, which might be stretching things a bit. But just to start, why don't we press into that? Why we're doing that? Why is this kind of an existential moment for Christians here?
I think there's a massive change here in the West, particularly in America, because of the acceleration through technology and various other things that have brought about a culture that we don't quite understand yet. So we're seeing a collapse of many familiar things. We're seeing the residual power of old things being used and weaponized in the culture, like church, religion, ethics, and morality, in a world of absolute freedom, materialism, and entertainment. So we're struggling to know who we are and what we are. And I think sometimes the church or Christians who have gone along with a kind of a Christendom type model where Christianity was accepted, it was a general cultural part of the background and had permission to speak, or even, pastors or leaders were allowed to do a chaplaincy at a football game or wake up or come to a presentation and say something nice to the kids. As long as you said something nice at the beginning or the end, sort of baptized that was fine. But religion wasn't taken seriously. It was controlled. So what I think has happened is the collapse of respect, and that model has really disintegrated and gone. So you're much more in a world now where it's a challenge of beliefs, where the idea is the gospel claiming to be about reality or truth. If people say that, you're on a collision course with radical relativism and just a culture that basically sees freedom and pleasure and autonomy as the primary driving issue. So it really does mean that Christianity then has to reconfigure and say, well, do I really believe this? Am I really willing to live the costs and consequences? And if so, what does that mean? What does that look like?
Stuart, it's interesting. You were saying we're in a culture of, and that little phrase is interesting, I think, within the church, because it sort of seems like some of the criticism and critique that I have is that we actually don't have a North American culture anymore, that it's fragmented into so many little micro subsections that to say, American culture almost doesn't make sense. To probably to most of our younger listeners, to say what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be an American Christian? That those labels are so diluted now, or watered down, or have so many different interpretations that it almost doesn't make sense. And so keep that question. I'm going to ask you two things at the same time. Is that true? And then B, use some of your global missional background and history here. I'm thinking of the rise and fall of nationalism within certain countries and how that's made it easier or more difficult for the church globally. Does any of that, like, for example, I know, like, back in the late 50s and early 60s, my grandparents were supposed to be missionaries in India, but then there was kind of this spike in Indian nationalism at the time. They didn't want any foreigners in the country. They're going to reclaim, the Indian identity. So they ended up going to Ecuador. But you see that from the Ukraine to Russia to, where are we? Is there a parallel kind of ebb and flow here in the tide of how we think about what it means to be one of what it is that we are? And does that parallel anything historically, globally? And what does that mean for the church now?
Let me see if I can remember. I'm an older guy. You got to allow for brain freezes here. The first part I would say is culturally. Now, an American culture, it's fair to say there is not one dominant American culture per se, but yet there are distinctive American characteristics. And so I would say
Okay.
that though there are cultures, plural, in the, with all different kinds of ethnic and historical feedback, there are particular ways of being American, which Americans would all acknowledge and people come to this country to become. And those are usually framed around issues of individualism, freedom, and prosperity. So I think the American way of doing life, either as an American Hindu or as an American Muslim or as an American Christian or as a secular, would still involve ideas of freedom, autonomy, and basically pleasure or self-expression in a very
Hmm.
unique way. People would notice that Americans are more fiercely individualistic than almost any other country. Not that the others don't have aversion, but not the way that Americans do. So that would be the first thing. The second piece to do with the nationalisms, and I think whenever identity changes over time and it's always in flux, so you have kind of constellations, if you like, or seasons of time where identity is a little bit more solid, maybe because of economy, because of nationalism, because of inherited traditions, the church or whatever. And
Or
there's
crisis or
there's an
war.
attempt to hold that. Yes, yeah, and then sometimes when that identity, certainly that from the French Revolution onwards, that was the basis of German nationalism or the rise of empires. The growing sense of identity in Europe became a thing that destroyed the empires and then turned to nationalism. That then itself became the answer was a bigger problem than the thing it was destroying in one sense. But we see that it always has to do with identity and calling, and as soon as you make yourself distinct, and we cannot not do that because we are
Hmm.
distinct, we are unique. The problem is when I elevate my distinctness, my being German over being French, or my being German over being Jewish, or my being, whatever it is, and then an ideology begins to shape around that. The ideologies always turn into idolatries, and idolatries always consume. So there's a
Hmm.
direct connection. And if we deny that we have universal dignity, that we're made in the image of God, by God, for God, all have value. There's a universal aspect to human nature in which I can value any human being anywhere, at any time, irrespective of their nationality, sex, or gender, or whatever. That's a very Christian view, but it has to be translated. Nationalism comes in and distorts that and puts the primacy in my locality, my identity, my ethnicity, or some other factor that then elevates and can, of course, become profoundly dangerous as it does and continues to do around the world today.
Can I get you to repeat a sentence there?
It's
Ideology leads to idolatry. Can you give us that sentence again? If you
Yeah.
remember.
Ideology is the fuel that leads to idolatry, and idolatry then leads to controls and slavery. Because ideas have consequences. Ideas are not neutral. And when an idea is elevated to an all controlling issue, or it's elevated beyond its parameters, so that, for instance, being a German national is a good thing. Germany as the superior race over all others is when it's turned into an ideology through Hitler, the Nazi Party, and company, it then becomes an ideology that it turns into an idolatry that then led to war. In that same pattern of ideology, whether it's the economy, you can do it with the ideology of that money is good. You teach it as an unfettered good. It turns into a form of greed at times. Greed becomes an idolatry, and then any economic agenda becomes allowable, permissible, because of the idolatry that we had, the idolatry we bow
Mm.
into,
Mhm.
the ideology that drives it and shapes it, and then the idol takes over, and the end part is slavery, or no other way to perceive reality except through that lens.
Yeah, I want to come back to something that you were saying earlier, and just because this might be kind of a convicting moment. We talked about Nathan. You phrased the question as there's it doesn't. Some people might say it doesn't make much sense to speak about one coherent U.S. culture. But actually, if you really dig into it, we have a whole lot more in common. The media will
Mhm.
focus so much on polarization and all of that, but I think again I reference this book quite a bit these days, but Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, which brings
Mhm.
together probably a good 30 or 40 years worth of thinking on this topic and distills it very clearly. But what he points out in there is no, actually, we're essentially as a nation agreed on two major things. And Dad, you just highlighted them. One is a kind of a negative conception of freedom to be able to do whatever we want, unconstrained, and that human beings are radically free and autonomous. We differ drastically on how we secure those goods, politically speaking. One party believes you need more of the government to do that. One party believes the government's a necessary evil and you need as little of it as
Right.
possible.
Mm-hmm.
But so my point here, why I'm going there is because this has infiltrated the church, this mindset. And I think part of I want your read on this. What I think is part of what I think is happening here in this existential moment is that Christians are having to reckon with the fact that they've bought into a vision of human flourishing that's quite foreign to the gospel, actually. And now that Christianity isn't established and it's not seen as respectable, it's not as comfortable here in the United States, it's a real shock to the system. Am I completely off there? Are we?
No,
Are we
I think actually I do. I have thought about this, and that doesn't make it right. Just have thought about it for many, many years. But by obviously living in Austria, traveling internationally, then coming to the United States, often speaking in other countries where you're being kind of asked to translate Christianity, and when you're in a kind of apologetic mode, so people are saying every kind of question, whether it's on sexuality, God and science, the problem of the Bible, all of that. So you're having to defend an entire system, an entire way of seeing reality. The problem is I would listen sometimes to Christian answers, even those from some of my friends. I would wince at times because I said that sounds very more like again my cultural version of saying the same thing, a particular take, which again I can't avoid to some degree. So what I think is missing, Cameron and Nathan as well, is that there are people who have done a theological deep dive into what does a Trinitarian understanding of reality look like? How does that reconceive how we think about things, not just what we think, but the very way we do our thinking? And I think that in the kind of a pragmatic, quick to answer model that we get in the West, we've evolved a kind of pop Christianity that doesn't do its theological homework. So people that look at, say, the rise of the technological world, and you can look on people like Jacques Ellul, the French writer. You can go to the non-Christian people like Neil Postman and others, and like this young guy Minich today, and others who are doing work, but it's not reaching the popular level. But it does look at some of these systemic things and the changes of how we think and what we think about. So I think sometimes it's come to the question is, again, what's the nature of reality? How does the gospel define that? What does a creational theology look like? And then the ethical and moral entailments come after. But we've got to know what reality is before we keep offering, both diagnosis and prognosis of what's right and wrong too quickly or a little bit carelessly, not applied consistently in understanding God's transcendence, God's immanence, God's holiness, God's power, God's grace, and what He is doing in the gospel and in us.
Let me be the pessimist here for a second. Um, can you think of historic examples of cultures doing that, of kind of recovering a post nationalism correct emphasis on the core of the gospel? Is this like once the cat's
Well,
out of the bag, it's run away, or what? I mean, do you see hopes of
there are different
reformation and
things,
restoration
Nathan.
and revival there?
Of course, there's always hope because God is alive and here, and there's always movement. And I think you can go back without doubt to historical moments when there were big things going on, particularly, say, like in Holland, when you have the influence of Abraham Kuyper and these kind of people at the turn when modernism was really hitting education and culture and society. Now, that didn't mean Kuyper had all the answers, but it was one version of reaction. You also have things like, say, at a lower level, things like during the Nazi period. Of course, we've mentioned many times people like Bonhoeffer, but then you had Karl Barth and others who began to look at theology and realized there were problems because of some of the philosophical stuff that had developed. The church had been domesticated, the gospel had been shrunk, and they came back with challenging, are we thinking clearly? Are we wrestling with the truth? I think after the Second World War, in the advent, the absolute destruction and the carnage of Europe, people don't realize that the foundation of the European and European steel and coal treaties, which was really trying to bring France and Germany together so that they wouldn't go to war again, was driven deeply by very Christian views, Jean Monnet and Konrad Adenauer, who were looking at Franco-German reconciliation and what became the basis of the European Economic, eventually the European Union. That was a bastardization because afterwards, a lot of the root stuff was neglected. There was profoundly spiritual and Christian ideas talking about reconciliation, relationships, trying to end war, or at least create a just peace. But over time, as prosperity came, as the ideas worked, then again, the Christian element was pushed aside, ignored, and eventually even formally denied in the latter European Union treaties. So that Christian truth that's often given the basis of a healthy thing over time is rejected, removed, and then the secularism takes over, which unleashes a new set of problems that then have to be revisited. So I would say the answer to that, the short answer is yes, there are always people in time. There are always Daniels, Esthers. There are always figures somewhere. There's an Abraham Lincoln sitting in the way. There's a Winston Churchill, Christian or non-Christian, that sometimes are used by God to provoke questions that bring us back. But Christians have to actively help in the shaping and not in forming a new idolatry, but in addressing a more human, a more humanizing, a more love-based, a more generous culture and approach to life.
And I mean, that's part of what I think is a little bit troubling that we need to all pay attention to as Christians right now, because on the one hand, you have many of us. I mean, we talk about this in the book that we wrote, Dad. When I moved to the United States, I bought very much into cultural Christianity for a long time. So my big era of rebellion didn't look particularly interesting or cool. I just looked like a good consumer.
Hmm.
But I think I was far from alone, and I think for a long time many of us did that as Christians, sometimes with the best of intentions, sometimes not so much, but we were good consumers. We had appetites that trended in a little bit more of a culturally conservative or traditional direction. And maybe we watched movies that were a little bit more wholesome or something like that. But by and large, we were still just good consumers who happened to be Christian. But
Hmm.
when then we, whatever you want to call our moment, we've entered into, you can say that the negative world, if we use Aaron Renn's terminology, or Christendom's over, whatever, however we want to label it.
Right.
Now that comfort is no longer available, it makes sense, I think, for Christians to say, well, we really need to push into how do we defend religious liberty? Okay, yeah, by all means. We run into a problem, though, when it becomes, no, we are going to fight. We're going to come out all guns blazing. We need to do something. I mean, desperate times call for desperate measures to get that back. That's where I think the idolatry piece comes in, because worldwide, Christians have always found that the gospel brings them into conflict with whatever cultural setting they find themselves in.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, I
I
mean, I
think
think that's part of, our problem too. We need to pay attention to that.
it is. And there's an underlying, I think, driving value at times for us, particularly in this part of the world, is that the comfort and convenience demands. We don't realize how central those are to us. And even as we frame and think theologically and ethically, we do so with a deep demand, a deep desire to try to bring back or basically establish comfort as convenience as a norm to control and have that. And as long as that's the issue, we're really not being kingdom centered. I think this idea of trying to reframe our parameters where God is central, where truth is real, irrespective of the consequences, and we bear the consequences and the cost of that, trusting that God is sovereign and God is good, and that my my
Yeah.
my invitation is to delight myself in the Lord. A country I want to remain nameless, but I received an email this week, or just at the beginning of last week, and it was a story again of a man going about his daily life, and a knock at the door, and there's four guys outside, and they start beating on him. The wife comes out and tries to help and rescue him. She's knocked unconscious. By the time she comes to, he's been hacked to death.
Mm.
And his child was inside the house at the time, and he's a believer in a predominantly other religious setting, as is often the case. Police were called. Of course, no one saw anything. No one knows anything. No one's been arrested, and no one is going to be prosecuted. And this is the norm, sadly, in several parts of the world. Now, they carry on worshiping. And I don't want to use the most extreme versions, but these are real. They're not extreme. They're real people in real time in our world happening to us. So while we're concerned almost of like trying to control the agenda or getting an America that works somehow so that comfort, convenience, and prosperity and power once again are ours, I think those are the wrong questions. I mean, I'm quite sure they're the wrong questions. The primary questions should be those framed by the gospel. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And what does that look like? And I don't rush to say I have an answer because I don't always know. But I want to be provoked. I want to be challenged, and I want to be changed by an ongoing dialogue with the scriptures and wrestling with what does love, justice, truth, and goodness look like today in this moment? How do we translate this into our communities, into our lives?
Let me jump in here to put a plug in for a teaching series that Stuart has done. If you go to toltogether.com and click on the courses tab, there's a 7-part series that Stuart has done on using the book of First Peter to walk through. Um, I think fire some shots directly at, not even over the bow of some of these issues, particularly the comforts and convenience. And just really good, solid teaching there. So I was kind of laughing when he said, "Well, I don't know that I have good answers." I was like, "Yeah, but you did do a 7-part series on framing the parameters to help us think about this biblically." So I think that speaks to both your genius and humility there. So thanks for doing that. And I would encourage those of you listening to check that series out and listen through them. Stuart, another question then. So we kind of talked about, okay, America's in this time and, it's not unique to us. Other nations and countries have gone through these things. The church has gone through far more difficult periods than what we're
Yeah.
experiencing in North America or whatever country you're listening to this from. All of you have different experiences there, but I guess what could we be doing? Think now for a second. We're speaking to younger audience, perhaps families with young children,
Mm.
um, or people listening interested in their grandchildren, the future of where this is going. I know you as a father and a grandfather. What do you wish and hope for young families to be teaching and training and talking to their children about to prepare them to live well and to avoid idolatry on one hand and complacency on the other hand? Do you have I mean, I know that's $1 million question, but do you just have some, like, as you're daydreaming of, like, what does the church need to be able to produce in people today in order for them to be faithful disciples moving forward? Where's your where does your daydreaming take you in that category?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that because yes, I am thinking about it. It's not. I haven't spent a lot of my time working with children, except obviously my own family. And, we've had kids around and I've always appreciated those who do children's ministry and take it
Amen.
very seriously.
Yes, indeed.
What I do see is a huge need to integrate that into a whole strategy, a much more greater, broader collaboration within a local church. So, for instance, we've been talking about that with my pastor and our leadership team. And so the three things, I don't know if this speaks accurately to it, Nathan. But I think I ask myself constantly, what would I like to see in my grandchildren? What would I like to see in some of the kids running around our church? What would I like to see in the teenagers? And the same questions keep coming back to me. I said, I'd like to see them to be Christ-centered and know what that means, that they not only they were in their minds, they felt it, they were Christ-centered, they knew that Christ was real, they loved him. The second thing I want them to be is gospel centered. So, what is the gospel? Understanding the distinction that the gospel is a message, and it's a message of truth, and it stands in contrast to the gods and the goddesses of this world and all of the idolatry around us. And the third thing would be to be kingdom orientated, understanding they're in a kingdom that where God is renewing something and his rule has begun, his kingdom is coming, it's a way of hope, and that Christianity is not a philosophy, it's a way. So, how to get that through them and journey with them at each stage of their life, knowing that the kids might be, not so much interested in one part or the other at particular times, but the teachers, the trainers, those who are participating in discipling would take that very seriously and would, in our community, would say, well, that's who we are. We have an identity, a calling, and so forth. So, my passion, my desire would be the part that I would like to play is help others who do that. So if I could fill the hands of the trainers in some way, maybe from experience and add some of what I've seen in life, then I want to pass that on. But those better actually communicating are finding ways to get the passion of connection, but create a climate and environment in which those things are driving the agenda.
It seems to me, as you say that, Dad, that we need more grown-ups who act like grown-ups in our
Mm.
churches. Because I think for so long, and this is a pretty big shift from what we were talking about earlier, but it goes along with the direction you've taken us, Nathan, on instilling basically passing faith on in a holistic way, and what we'd like to see in Christians, younger Christians. But I mean, America, again, the glory of this nation is how innovative we are, and
Mm.
we're a can-do nation. But that's also, there are some drawbacks there as well. And one of those drawbacks is that we have fetishized youth and just younger voices. I mean, if you look at, even if you look at the way curriculums are structured, or books are marketed, or any resource is made, it's always made to cater to younger voices, and we always want to hear from newer ideas, cutting edge. But what we're seeing now, I mean, I think this explains in part the immense popularity of somebody like a Jordan Peterson, who is a very much a father figure to many members of his audience. Is that, yet younger people want stability and maturity in the people they look up to, and so I think that's not something I hear too often when we're getting exhortations at at different Christian events or in church, but to grow up and be mature and be a grown up and be an adult Christian person,
Mhm.
helping to lead these younger people and show them a better way and offer that stability. Yes, parents, of course, but all of us in our church settings, especially, that's where it's going to be, in our households and in our churches. That's where it's going to be the most important. It's funny. It's hard to make that sound really edgy or cool or catchy, but I think that's part of what you're getting at, and that seems to be what's so needed.
But therein lies in part of the problem, Cameron. I think you're naming it well. I think the this press that we often feel, even all of us who are speakers too, our shares, the press for cool relevance, homo up to datum, as Oz calls it, to trying to be cool and trendy, and then this fetish for that in the church
Mm.
is part of the problem, because basically what we are doing is we have cheapened and denied and denigrated transgenerational wisdom. And therefore,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
even in the church, the danger is that we have, when we think of trying to do things as intergenerational, increasingly we do what the market does. What do? We segment our church, we segment our homes, we specialize, we outsource. And so, I can't speak to a group of kids. Why? Because there's a teenager who speaks to them, and he's got a podcast and 30,000 followers or whatever it is. And you know and it's not that I'm yearning to speak to teenagers per se, but what I'm saying is that there's not an easy access, because it's all specialist and controlled. I can speak if I get an invitation into someone's platform, and it might be a novelty, but there's not an ongoing feeder system that allows for that.
But
So
teenagers
this
need to
is
hear from you, though. I mean, that part of one of the things our listeners love is they love hearing quotes from Grandpa Rittenhouse. And those we haven't had one. We haven't had one yet, Nathan. So you're lagging behind here, brother. But usually we. But
You haven't
I
quoted
think
Dallas
part of
Willard either, though, so this is just
that's
a
true.
unique episode. So
Yeah, you're right. But I think part of what people relish about that is so few of them have that kind of relationship with somebody who is Nathan's grandfather's age. I mean,
well,
and that's
yeah, but this is
yeah,
the value
it's
that
a
Stuart's
loss.
bringing here, is that I think the reason that we sometimes love to hear older voices is very few people get to have an idea and then live that idea out consistently for multiple decades. And, so in a time when news and ideas are cheap, the 19-year-old neat idea, let's see you do it for 25 years and then come back and talk about it. I think there's that. I sense that in myself, that sort of, yeah, but all right, neat idea, but can you really do it? Can you really live it? Is this actually doable? Does this really honor the Lord if we pursue this to run it to its logical conclusion? So I think that's the, you
I
know,
had a
the balance
a
there.
memory there, Nathan, of an experience many years ago where it was in very much the place you're talking about. So I'm the young, probably in my 30s or something like late 20s, early 30s. I was there at a conference in Holland, and I was speaking, and there was this well-known Dutch guy was speaking, and my friend and I were so determined to get time with him, because he just oozed wisdom, and we'd heard him, and he had just these profound thoughts. We thought, right, we'll go to him, and of course we went, and as young people often do, we went, and we were doing all the talking, and and he's just, and then he just looked at, he says, guys. You guys are the strategists. He says, I'm done with all that. He says, you go figure it out. He says, I just want to preach the gospel. And he says, and what he was reacting upon was my friend, particularly this friend who was a New Zealander, is very intense and about organizing and understanding structure. Where could we as church where's the keynote point, and what could we do, and how could we mass this? And we were reading, Kuyper and every kind of thing. We're reading, all the great thinkers of the time, reading Os Guinness and trying to put this together and come up with some grand renewal strategy for Europe. And he just basically patted his head and goes, go do it, and I'll just carry on doing what I'm doing. And he wasn't being impolite, but he was tired. And his message, when he spoke to the crowd, there were about 6,000 or 7,000 young people there. It was electric. It was just fabulous, because it was gospel. It was clear, and it was. But he had learned over time, I need to move away from that. Not that strategy was invalid or any of these things, but this idea of fixing the world, controlling the world, managing it, managing the kingdom into existence, is God's world. It's God's kingdom. It's God's power. It's God's grace. We have to keep returning to him and putting our trust there,
I think that's a kind of a great way to end. And if I could sort of summarize the trajectory of where I've seen this conversation going, we sort of started off with like, what's wrong with the world? Really big, came down into the nation. Then we looked at the next generation coming along. But really, I think both of you reminded us that actually this starts with us individually modeling this well. It's not just the children that I want to have a Christ-centered, gospel-centered, and kingdom-oriented life. I need that for myself. And I can't model it if I'm not living it myself. And I think that's the wisdom you're saying in the older preacher there, who had a clear sense of identity, who he was, what his actual calling was, and then let the fruit grow and flourish from there. So it's not to say that strategy is bad, or that having an interest in the future of the church in Japan or whatever is happening in the United States politically is bad. It's just that can't be the place at which we worship, or we're slipping right back into this idolatry. The ideology that creates bondage, as Stuart laid out for us. So thank you so much, Stuart, for, off the cuff schooling us in the history of the world and everything in it. I'm sure we'll have you back with all the spinoff questions that have generated off of this. But thank you so much for your time. Thanks for those who have been listening along with us. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.